All right, welcome everybody to Eagles Power Hour, and today I am joined with Dan Thompson. What would the correct title be? The Eastern beat reporter for the Spokesman? Would that be
Yeah, yeah, that's what I would call it. Yeah.
pretty good? So Dan has been out to a number of fall camp practices so far this year, and so I invited him to come on and just try to get a little bit of his insight for the people like me and like others that haven't been able to see any Eastern practice so far. Kind of give us an idea of how the team's been looking so far. So let's start it off. I mean, at Eastern Washington, the most important player on the field is almost always the quarterback. So let's talk about Kikoa. Generally, how has Kikoa looked and kind of his development from the spring and from last year so far this fall?
Yeah, I think he looks about where he's at. It's exciting, I think, for the Eagles because he's only a redshirt junior, right? So he's
Hmm.
already got a full year plus a couple games of starting experience, which is something that if you're in the Big Sky like that, and now you've seen, I think, basically every team, you've played against almost every team. That's a huge advantage. He's going to be their quarterback who's going to throw the most. I think what's so interesting about that position is that they've got three guys who they're going to use. They're going to use Wortham, they're going to use Jared Taylor, and the question is, how are they going to do that? Now, in practices, there's been a lot of drills where they're both, or there's two of them in the backfield working together, and sometimes there's one of them split. They are being very flexible. We saw them in games last year where even Tuna would take a direct snap, and you'd have Keikoa out there. They are really excited about having those core ball handlers back, because if you figure Efton Chisholm can also handle the ball decently enough. I mean, I'm very curious to see what they actually do with the guys in the backfield, because it's not just going to be Kakoa.
Yeah, no, and like you said, we saw a lot of that throughout last year where there'd just be two or even three quarterbacks on the field at a time. I'm really interested to see how they build on that because I think a lot of Eastern fans after last year were like, dude, use Michael Wortham more. Like people really wanted to see him more. And that's something I saw in the spring. I felt like he was worked into the offense a lot more. And have you kind of seen that so far? It seems like they're leaning towards using him more
Yeah, I
in the
mean,
offense.
when I talked to him a week or two ago, I mean, he's even practicing returning punts. And so,
Hmm.
you figure they're going to get him on the field as much as possible. Now, they also have to have some caution because he's one of the backup quarterbacks. But I think that's also why the development of a guy like Nate Bell, potentially Aiden Carter, is also important, because you're going to be playing your top three quarterbacks. You don't want anybody to get hurt, but they are going to use Wortham even more and more, just because he's more and more comfortable. They can use him in more and more installs. And offensive coordinator Jim Chapin is really creative with how he uses these guys. He's also this is his third or fourth year now in the
Yep.
system. And so there's just a big comfort level. I think the expectation out of this offense is that this is a top three offense in the Big Sky. It's going to be hard to replicate when they had Barrier, because that was just, he's a special player. Um, I think maybe Kakoa could get to that point, but they're not geared towards the one quarterback anymore like they were then. And that, so I think that will suppress people's numbers. But to come back to your question, Michael Wortham is going to throw, catch, and run a little bit, and we're going to see,
Hmm.
there might be games where he does a little bit of all three.
Yeah, I'm so excited to see what the heck they use him for. It should be definitely interesting concepts and stuff like that to just see how they get the ball in the dude's hands because he's explosive as heck. So I saw a tweet that you put out the other day about the Eagle offensive line, and it kind of surprised me. So the other day, Dan tweeted about just kind of the personnel, and he said the starting five offensive linemen, starting left to right, Dylan Connor at left tackle. He's the redshirt sophomore. That was the spot that had been previously played by captain and senior Wyatt Hansen. And I kind of shocked me that he wasn't in the starting five, as you would say. Left guard Luke Dahlgren, center Jack Seeley, right guard Brendan Rivera, right tackle Michigan transfer Noah Stewart. So generally, I mean that personnel thing kind of surprised me a little bit. Not like shocked me, but it surprised me a little bit. What would you say or what have you seen from the offensive line and kind of have you seen much growth? Have you seen I
Yeah, I
guess
mean,
what are your
it's
takeaways there?
it is hard when I'm, as a guy looking at the offensive line, I very much rely, perhaps more than any other position, on the other coaches that I talk to,
Hmm.
because it's very hard to tell. It's kind of a layman, what you see during
Yep.
drills, because they're mostly just pushing people and things around, right? You do mention Wyatt Hansen in there. They always talk about having, 7 or 8, maybe 9
Yeah.
guys who can even rotate in. They have been high on Dylan Connor for a
Yeah.
couple years, and so I think they expect big things out of him. He's a big guy, and he's 6'5", 290 is what he's listed as right now. But you're right, we're going to see plenty of Wyatt Hansen in there too. Luke Dahlgren is a veteran, a guy who came back, for an extra year, which is kind of a trend with this team. There were a handful of guys, Darian Sampson, Brock Harrison, guys that could have moved on with their lives but wanted to come back, which I think is always a good sign for a program when you've got guys who want to be there for their 6th and 7th years. Jack Seeley is a transfer who they really liked last year. He played last year, and now he's taken over the center spot. Brendan Rivera, he's suddenly very senior. The big surprise, I don't know what to call it a surprise, but Noah Stewart. I looked at practice and I thought, who is this very giant man? I think he's listed at 6'7", but he played
Hmm.
at Michigan in a reserve role. He has 2 years of eligibility remaining, is what they've told me. But he is a guy that I think I was surprised to see a newcomer step in like that into a starting spot, because that's not often what they do. It's pretty hard to be able to, at a school that prides itself so much on offensive line play and rewards guys being there for a long time. That is a really good sign that they've got a guy like Noah Stewart there. That's going to help them obviously in their rushing game. In an offense where you've got quarterbacks moving all over the place and the pocket is kind of a fluid space a lot of times, to have a veteran guy like that with some major college football experience, I think is going to be big for them. This is a pretty deep group. You figure they've also got Matthew Habebadige back there as a
Hmm.
as a graduate student. There is a lot of experience there, and then there's always a lot of freshmen standing around. It's funny going to practice because it's like, well, there's a whole bunch of 6'4", 6'5" guys, and the question is, can they really figure out technique? How dedicated are they, and who's going to last? So that's something to see, because you look, they got 3 seniors in there. You also mentioned Wyatt
Hmm.
Hansen. So this is a big year for that offensive line, because next year there's going to be a lot of turnover.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, if Connor wasn't in there, it literally you'd be returning one guy next year on the offensive line. So
Mm-hmm.
a whole bunch of turnover, and I think a lot of, at least for me, I was really looking at those 2s and 3s on the offensive line last spring. Like, well, what do we got going on the next,
Mm-hmm.
in the fold, because these guys have been here for so long, we kind of know what we're gonna get. I was really impressed with Dylan Connor in the snaps he played last year as a redshirt freshman
Mm-hmm.
and how he looked in the spring. That dude, he's what, 6'5", 300 pounds, probably somewhere around there, and he can move pretty well too. And I was pretty impressed with what I saw from him. And like you said, I'm surprised that Noah Stewart's been getting 1 snaps. Not necessarily surprised that it's not like a surprise, like I can't believe he's a starter, but
Mm-hmm.
like you said, it's not very typical that a new guy comes in and is a starter right away, especially when you have someone that's been playing that position the last 4 or 5 years in Wyatt Hansen and has really been kind of a cornerstone of the Eagle offensive line. Kind of playing over him, it surprised me a little bit, but
Yeah, and it was one day. I mean, like,
yeah,
that's not always going to be the case. They are going to need a lot of tackles. They're going to need a lot of interior
absolutely,
linemen, and so yeah, they've got a lot of depth there, is what it looks like right now.
which is definitely a luxury when you're playing in the Big Sky with all these teams that
Mm-hmm.
order number one is get to the quarterback. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
all right. I think the only other position group really, I guess we didn't talk about the running backs really, but like the receivers, I feel like we kind of know what's going on with the receivers in general. There's a few transfers, but it's Efton Chisholm, it's Nolan Ulm, and it's Miles Williams. They're going to be good. They're going to be very good. Efton Chisholm, he's been named to a number of all-American preseason and preseason all-conference teams and stuff like that. So we'll kind of skip over that and go to kind of the more interesting side of the ball for most Eagle fans. The defense. The defense has
Mm-hmm.
been awful the last 2 years, but I was there this spring for a number of practices, and I think I saw like a light at the end of the tunnel. Like, hey, this defense is getting better, and they didn't even have most of the starters out there. So generally, we're just gonna go very general right now. How has the defense just looked, and how has it felt kind of culturally with the new defensive coordinator in there, and what have you seen there?
Yeah. So when I've talked to Eric Sanders, the new defensive coordinator, he was the linebackers coach last year. He's still coaching the linebackers now. But he pointed to that Fresno State game as kind of that's the way they want to play. And gosh, if they play defense like that in the Big Sky, they're going to win a lot of games. They don't need to be fantastic, but they need to be obviously better. They need to be able to stop the run. And that's still going to be the question. You know, do they have the size to be able to push around and the depth really? Now they were really young actually at some key spots last year. You're looking at a guy like Jaden Radke played a lot of minutes. You've got Ben Voigtlander played a lot of minutes too. They're not going to be counted on in the same way necessarily, but you've got those guys. I guess what I see is a lot of energy and also a lot of guys who redshirted last year or played last year as true freshmen who are going to be given the opportunity to step in. I'm thinking of guys like Derek Ganter, who, when I talk to
Mhm.
the players and I talk to coaches, they think he's going to be a star at safety. I see guys like Samurai Anderson at least getting a lot of snaps in the rotation right now. We'll see kind of where he goes. They have depth at linebacker in terms of they have Adam Cohen, they have Derek Tomasini back, Trevor Thurman they really like, though he's been also moved around a little bit, playing a little edge.
Mhm.
So that is also the other thing I'm curious about is when we get into games, what are we going to see as far as getting pressure on the quarterback? They weren't awful at sacks last year, but if they could just be disruptive, get on the other side of the line of scrimmage a little bit more, that's going to be big. I'm also looking at a guy like Tylen Jackson,
Yeah.
a defensive end who I remember going to basketball games this year, and I think he hit a half court shot.
Yeah.
I
He
mean, this
did.
guy, he's an athlete that they really like, and so we will see. The big test, I guess, if I can boil it down, is will some of those redshirt freshmen and true freshmen last year who are now sophomores, are they really going to step up and contribute in meaningful ways? That is a talented group. If you look at all of the recruiting sites, and I know that there's limitations there, but that's a pretty good group, as well as the true freshmen now. I think it's exciting for them. If they're not better on defense, obviously that's a huge problem. You know, they should be a playoff team if their defense can get just a little bit better. I'll say that.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there because the talent is there on both sides of the ball. In my opinion, I think the talent is there on both sides of the ball.
Hmm.
I think last year, really, the defensive line, like the edges were a little thin. You had a lot of young guys, but
Hmm.
and the linebacker core wasn't the most like they weren't the most reliable of all time, but they had experience there. It the talent is generally there. In the secondary, you have guys that would be starting at other Big Sky schools, in my opinion. On the
Hmm.
defensive line, you have guys that probably would be starting at other Big Sky schools. I think a lot of it boils down to how those linebackers react to playing in a slightly modified system because, like, schematically, the system isn't that much different. I think it's more of like a mindset and probably just more of a mindset slash culture thing
Hmm.
where Coach Sanders is going to be a lot more of a hey, go attack, go hit someone, go play fierce, cause chaos. That's what we do here. Whereas I don't know if this is totally accurate, but from watching it, Coach Kopp's defense was a lot more trying to be a little too perfect, I think sometimes. And it just led the guys playing slow. And
Hmm.
so I'm hoping to see guys generally just flying around this year because I think that would make a big difference in both the run and the pass defense. I think mainly in the run defense is where the biggest concerns are. I'm really excited about what I saw in the spring with like the things Coach Sanders is doing with coverage. I
Hmm.
think in the Big Sky where you tend to have a lot of quarterback turnover. I think if you have some young guys that haven't seen that secondary before at quarterback, I think we're going to be forcing some turnovers this year. So, especially if the defensive line can step it up and we can, uh, you know, get some pressure on the quarterback.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, generally, I'm really excited. They're young and fiery group in general. So a lot of energy there. Also, there's a lot of transfers on the defensive side of the ball. I was really curious if you noticed any transfers defensively. I guess we get on the offense too, but defensively, any of those big names. We had a couple of big names. Anthony James II is the first one that comes to mind. You had a guy like the linebacker from Boise State. His name is completely escaping me right now. I think it's Deshaun Misa or Hunter Misa, something like that.
Mhm,
A
mhm.
lot of big impact names on the defense. Have they made an impact quite yet? From what you saw at practice?
I think that it's early.
Yeah.
It's early in practices, and they need to learn so much of the system. Ultimately, I've learned that I got to look at the guys who are actually getting reps. I don't see a ton of transfers getting a ton of reps right now when they break off into those team drills and things like that. But that doesn't mean they can't. We're still only just a week and a half or two into practices.
Hmm.
They would like that, but I also think that when Aaron Best talks about kind of that EKG guy, the Eagles kind of guy, often it is those freshmen who they come in as freshmen and then they develop. They really end up being those core guys. So we'll see. In years past, we've seen some guys. I am curious to see on the offensive side, a guy that kind of stands out to me is the receiver Noah Cronquist, who's a JUCO guy. They really, if anything, they actually kind of like those JUCO guys because they've proven it. A lot of times when you get the guys from FBS levels, they're here now in Eastern because they haven't gotten the playing time. And I think
Hmm.
that there's something about, you look at like Austin York, who has really stepped in. Well, he played. So Michael Wortham, Jared Taylor. So if anything, it's the JUCO guys that historically have made more of an impact because it's like, well, I ran for 800 yards in college or at the JUCO, or all those things that Wortham and Taylor have done. So I would, if I had to boil it down, I would say I would expect they're going to maybe get more out of the JUCO guys ultimately than they will out of the drop downs.
For sure. I agree with that, and I know what you're talking about with. I feel like they really like the JUCO guys because there isn't that ego in the back of their head that like, hey, I might be better than this, and it just leads to them working harder. I think sometimes
Hmm.
no shots at any FBS transfers, but think of a shoot. Jack Seeley was another one of those guys as well,
Hmm.
and he had a really good year last year. He started the year, had a few little dumb mistakes, and then by the end of the year, he was looking like a really really solid center. And they have a number of those guys again this year because they signed another JUCO offensive lineman that he's going to be kind of a plug and play type guy for them. They signed a tight end, Landon Cooper. He's a guy that looks like he could probably play right away and be a really good run blocker. I like I really want to see how the JUCO guys make a difference, but the FBS guys get me excited just because of that high end talent on the defensive side of the
Absolutely.
ball.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
when you look at a guy like Deshaun slash Hunter Misa, he he was I think he was a 4-star recruit coming out of high school, and he was like Boise State's highest rated recruit of all time. You look at the film, at least you look at the practice film that he has posted on his Twitter, and he looks the part. He looks like a guy that could make a big impact. So he's a guy that I really have my eyes on as a just an overall talent thing that I think his talent could make a big difference on the defensive side of the ball this year.
Yeah,
Um,
and even if it's not this year, it may be next year, down the road. I mean,
for sure.
sometimes it takes those guys a year to kind
He
of get
still
looked in.
has 2 or 3 years eligibility remaining, I believe,
Hmm.
which is very, very nice. Same with Anthony James the second. The other
Hmm.
James and Deshaun Misa were the 2 guys that a lot of people on, like, Facebook groups and stuff like that were highlighting, like, "Whoa, how do we get these guys?" So,
Right.
those will
Right.
be names to keep an eye on for the next few years. Alright, and then do you have any other just general thoughts that you'd like to hit on before we wrap it up here?
Um, I think, special teams isn't always the thing to talk about. I think, but we
Mhm.
saw many moments last year where the special teams were crucially important. Obviously, the kicking game. I am really curious to see how they use Jackson Cleaver and Soren McKee. They also have a transfer punter in Landon Ogles, who came over from Fresno State. He actually had punted at the JUCO level as well. So I'm curious to see if they can solidify those teams, because that's obviously been a weak point. Soren McKee has been more accurate when I've watched, but
Mhm.
Cleaver has such a stronger leg. That's it's kind of that classic balance. I'm curious to see how they can do that. It is so hard to find college kickers, which it wouldn't
Mhm.
seem like it would be, because gosh, there's got to be some soccer players you can pull over and things like that. But it is a key spot for them, and they're hoping to be in some close games. So I'm hoping for their sake, that they can find maybe that McKee can be solid. I just don't see him making a 50-yard field goal. And so I'm
Mm-hmm.
curious to see how that shakes out. I'm curious to see how the putter situation shakes out. If Ogles actually steps in there, or if we're going to see maybe more out of a guy, like Brandon Smith, or a guy like, I'm trying to find the name of the other one, Brady Peterson, because they need to replace Nick Kokich in a
Mm-hmm.
real way. So that is actually something that I'm watching, and that's hard to see until we actually watch some scrimmages next week, and then games, which are only a couple weeks away.
Mm-hmm. Super excited. Special teams definitely has been a weak spot for Eastern the last, I don't know, the last 4 or 5 years in
Mhm.
general. Just since the exit of Heath Pulver, I feel like the special teams has just not been quite the same level that it, because there's years there where Eastern special teams was always very good. You had really good returners, you had really good kickers, you had really good punters, and then we just had a stretch of kind of every time the place kicker goes out there, you're like, I don't know. So
Right, right.
I feel like
And
it'll
they're
make
not
a big
alone in that. I
difference
mean, like in the Big Sky, there's very few teams
for
that
sure.
really feel good about their kicking game. At least on paper, it doesn't. So, we'll see with that. But yeah, they have Danny McDonald now coaching the special teams
Hmm.
exclusively. Before it was kind of a piecemeal where maybe a coach would do the kickoffs coverage team, and another one would be the punt return and things like that. They do really want to get more of that out of that punt return. It
Yeah.
feels like when people are watching Eagles games, there's a lot of fair catches, and they want to be able to get stop those gunners and create a little bit more space because Chisholm is electric. They want to maybe use Wortham back there, but they got there's a lot of guys on this team who can return punts and do it well if they're given some space to actually do it.
Yep. As usual, it's usually not the actual star that's handling the ball. It's the dirty work up front that actually makes a difference. So,
Exactly.
all right. Well, I think that's kind of all we had. Just a quick little episode for you guys today. Quick little update on fall camp and what Dan has been seeing out there. We'll be having like a official season preview episode coming up here soon with me and Kyler. And so, yeah. Any last thoughts before we sign off here?
No, thanks for having me. I appreciate it, and they should be a fun team to watch this year. I think they're going to be very competitive, and they have a tough schedule. I know you're going to talk about that.
Absolutely.
So the people who watch this team are gonna know a lot about this team by mid-October.
For sure. Definitely, guys, go check out Dan Thompson's work with the Spokesman's Review. I'll have it all linked down in the description below. He's been writing about the football team a couple times a week. It seems like, anyways. So definitely go check out his work. Do you want to shout out any social media or anything like that?
Yeah, you can find me on X. That's where I post most of my stuff. And yeah, go to the Spokesman Review, the spokesman.com. You can find it all there too.
Sweet. I will link all that below. And thank you guys for watching and listening. And go Eagles.